There is something deeply unsettling about certain people, not because of how they look or how they speak, but because of what they hide. Evil doesn't always come with a warning sign. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. And the most dangerous people? They don't look dangerous at all. They blend in, they charm, they convince. But if you pay attention, if you observe closely, there are patterns. There are traits. Today we uncover 7 personality traits that often reveal a person with an evil heart. Most people think they can easily recognize when someone cares, but the truth is, the absence of empathy is far more subtle and far more dangerous than it appears. A person lacking empathy doesn't walk around announcing it. Instead, they learn to simulate it. They study reactions, mirror emotions, and deliver the right response at the right time. But if you observe closely, something always feels slightly off. Their concern sounds correct, but it doesn't feel real. It's like watching a performance rather than experiencing genuine human connection. When you open up to them, they listen but not to understand you. They listen to gather information. Your fears, your insecurities, your emotional triggers, all of it becomes data. And later, that data can be used to influence you, control you, or even break you down. You may notice that when you're in pain, they don't respond with warmth, they respond with curiosity. Almost like a scientist studying a reaction. They might ask questions, but those questions lack emotional depth. There's no softness, no shared feeling, just analysis. Another key signal is inconsistency. Sometimes they appear caring, other times completely cold. That's because their empathy is not natural, it's strategic. When being kind benefits them, they will display it. When it doesn't, it disappears instantly. Real empathy doesn't switch on and off like a button. It's steady. It's human. But in someone with an evil heart, it's calculated and conditional. You'll also find that they struggle to take your perspective. Even in situations where your feelings are obvious, they minimize or dismiss them. They may say things like, "You're overreacting," or "It's not a big deal," not because they're trying to help, but because they genuinely don't feel what you feel. And instead of trying to understand, they reduce your experience to something insignificant. Over time, this creates confusion. You begin to question your own emotions. You wonder if you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional. And that's where the real damage happens. Because once you start doubting your own emotional reality, they gain control. A person without empathy doesn't just fail to connect, they disconnect others from themselves. And that's what makes this trait so powerful and so dangerous. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It's quiet, controlled, and often invisible until the damage is already done. Most people assume manipulation is obvious, that it looks like control, pressure, or force. But in reality, the most effective manipulation is invisible. It doesn't feel like you're being controlled, it feels like you're making your own decisions. That's exactly how a highly manipulative person operates. They don't push you directly. They guide you subtly, shaping your thoughts until you arrive exactly where they wanted you to be. It often starts with small shifts in conversation. They reframe situations, plant ideas, and introduce doubt at just the right moment. You might walk into a conversation feeling certain about something and walk out questioning everything. Not because they argued aggressively, but because they redirected your perception. This is not random behavior. It's intentional. Every word, every pause, every reaction is calculated to move you in a specific direction. One of the most powerful tools they use is confusion. When you're confused, you're easier to control. So they contradict themselves, change narratives, or give partial truths. When you try to make sense of it, you get stuck in a loop. You start asking more questions, seeking clarity, but clarity never comes. And in that state of uncertainty, they position themselves as the only stable point of reference. Slowly, you begin relying on them to define what's real. They also use emotional leverage with precision. They identify what matters most to you, your fears, your desires, your need for approval, and they pull those strings at the perfect moment. If you fear abandonment, they create distance. If you crave validation, they give it, then take it away. This push and pull dynamic keeps you engaged, constantly trying to regain balance. But the balance is never meant to return. It's a system designed to keep you invested. Another pattern is strategic victimhood. When confronted, they don't defend, they reverse roles. Suddenly, they're the misunderstood one, the hurt one, the one being accused unfairly. This shifts your focus. Instead of holding them accountable, you find yourself explaining, justifying, even apologizing. The conversation moves away from their behavior and onto your reaction. And just like that, they regain control without ever addressing the issue. Over time, this constant manipulation erodes your confidence. You begin to second-guess your instincts. Decisions that once felt simple now feel overwhelming. You look to them for reassurance, for direction, for truth. And that's the objective, to make you dependent. Because a person who constantly manipulates doesn't just want influence, they want authority over how you think, how you feel, and how you see reality. And the most dangerous part is, by the time you realize it, you've already been playing their game for far too long. At first, everything about them feels effortless. The way they speak, the way they carry themselves, the way they seem to understand people so quickly, it creates an immediate sense of trust. You feel seen, heard, even valued. But what you're experiencing isn't genuine connection, it's precision. A highly controlled presentation designed to lower your defenses. They pay close attention in the beginning, not because they're emotionally invested, but because they're collecting patterns. Your tone, your humor, your preferences, your emotional responses, they study all of it. And then they reflect it back to you. Same interests, same values, same energy. It feels like alignment, like rare compatibility. But in reality, it's calibration. Their charm is not random, it's targeted. Around different people, they become different versions of themselves. Confident in one room, vulnerable in another, authoritative when needed, soft when it serves them. This flexibility isn't authenticity, it's control. They adapt quickly because their goal isn't to express who they are, it's to become what works. Over time, subtle inconsistencies begin to surface. Small things at first, stories that don't fully match, reactions that feel slightly delayed, expressions that don't quite reach the eyes. You might ignore it because everything else feels so convincing, but those small gaps are signals. Real personality is consistent. A constructed one requires constant adjustment, and that creates friction. Another pattern is conditional warmth. In the beginning, their attention feels intense. They engage deeply, respond quickly, make you feel important. But once they feel they've secured your trust, that intensity shifts. The warmth becomes selective. Sometimes they're fully present, other times distant and unavailable. This change isn't accidental, it's strategic. It creates uncertainty, which increases your focus on them. You start trying to figure out what changed, how to bring back that earlier version. And in doing so, you invest more. They also manage perception carefully. They know how to appear trustworthy in front of others. They use social proof, controlled vulnerability, and well-timed generosity to build an image. So even if you start noticing inconsistencies, it becomes difficult to question them openly. From the outside, they seem solid. That external validation reinforces the illusion. What makes this particularly effective is that the performance is smooth. There are no obvious breaks, no clear moments where the mask drops completely. Instead, it's a series of micro-adjustments, subtle shifts that keep the image intact while slowly changing the dynamic underneath. A genuinely charming person remains consistent even when there's nothing to gain. But someone operating from strategy will always be calculating outcomes. The moment you start paying attention to patterns instead of moments, the difference becomes clear. Because real connection doesn't require constant management, but a constructed persona always does. Most people assume that when someone makes a mistake, there will be at least a moment of recognition, a pause, a shift in tone, some sign of internal correction. But with a person who avoids accountability, that moment never comes. Instead, what you see is immediate redirection. The focus moves away from their behavior and onto something else: your reaction, the circumstances, or even an entirely unrelated issue. When confronted, they don't process, they respond. And the response is fast, almost rehearsed. They might deny outright even when the facts are clear, or they'll minimize the situation, reducing something significant into something trivial. If denial doesn't work, they shift into justification. There's always a reason, always an explanation that places their actions in a more acceptable light. The goal is not to resolve the issue, the goal is to escape responsibility. One of the most consistent patterns is deflection. You bring up a specific concern, and somehow the conversation expands. Now it's not just about what they did, it's about what you did last week, or something you said months ago. The original issue gets buried under layers of distraction. And if you're not careful, you'll find yourself defending things that were never the point. This is how control is maintained, by constantly moving the target. They also rely heavily on reframing. Instead of acknowledging harm, they reinterpret it. What you experienced as hurtful becomes a misunderstanding. What felt intentional becomes taken the wrong way. This subtle shift changes the narrative. It places doubt on your perception without directly confronting it. And over time, repeated exposure to this kind of reframing can make you question your own interpretation of events. Another tactic is selective memory. Details that would hold them accountable are conveniently forgotten, while details that support their position are recalled with precision. This creates an uneven version of reality, one where they always appear reasonable and you appear uncertain. It's not random, it's controlled recall, used to maintain a consistent image. What stands out most is the absence of genuine ownership. Even when they say "I'm sorry," it often lacks substance. The apology is vague, sometimes followed by a subtle justification or a shift back onto you. There's no clear acknowledgement of what was done, no indication of change. It functions more as a tool to end the conversation than to repair anything. Over time, this pattern has an effect. You begin to hesitate before bringing things up. You anticipate the deflection, the denial, the reversal. And in that hesitation, they gain more space to operate without challenge. Because a person who refuses accountability isn't just avoiding blame, they're maintaining control over the narrative. And as long as they control the narrative, they control how reality is defined within that interaction. Most people expect that when someone around them is struggling, there will be a natural response: concern, support, or at the very least, restraint. But with a person who takes pleasure in others' discomfort, the response is different. It's subtle, controlled, and often hidden behind socially acceptable behavior. On the surface, they may appear neutral or even mildly supportive, but if you observe closely, there are small indicators that point in another direction. It often begins with micro-reactions. A slight delay before responding to bad news, a controlled expression that almost looks like interest rather than concern. The timing feels off. Where most people react instinctively, they seem to process it differently, almost as if they're evaluating the situation instead of feeling it. There's a noticeable absence of emotional alignment. In conversation, they may position themselves as engaged listeners, but their questions reveal something else. Instead of focusing on how you're handling the situation, they focus on details that intensify the experience. They ask for specifics not to help, but to expand the moment. The more vivid your explanation, the more engaged they become. It's not empathy driving the interaction, it's stimulation. You'll also notice patterns in humor. Jokes that consistently target vulnerability, delivered in a way that allows them to deny intent if challenged. The tone might be light, but the content isn't random. It's directed. And when those jokes land, there's often a brief moment, subtle but visible, where they register the impact. Not with concern, but with a kind of internal acknowledgement. Then it's quickly masked. Another indicator is how they respond to setbacks that don't involve them directly. When someone else fails, they may appear calm, even indifferent. But over time, you may detect a shift in their energy, slightly more engaged, slightly more present. They might revisit the topic later, bringing it up again under the guise of conversation. Repetition like this isn't accidental. It keeps the focus on the event, extending its presence. There's also a tendency to escalate situations quietly. Small comments, well-placed observations, or subtle comparisons that increase tension between others. They don't create conflict openly, they influence it from the edges. And when discomfort rises, they remain just outside of it, observing. Not intervening, not de-escalating, just present. What makes this pattern difficult to detect is that it rarely crosses clear boundaries. Each individual action can be explained, justified, or dismissed. But when viewed over time, a consistent structure appears, one where other people's discomfort becomes a point of engagement rather than something to reduce. Because for this type of individual, the environment is not something they emotionally share, it's something they interact with. And moments that carry intensity, especially negative intensity, hold their attention in a way that reveals far more than their words ever will. Most people think of lying as something occasional, a response to pressure, fear, or consequence. But in this pattern, lying isn't a reaction, it's a default setting. It's integrated into how the person communicates, how they manage perception, and how they maintain control over their environment. The goal isn't just to avoid trouble. The goal is to shape reality in a way that always benefits them. It starts with small distortions. Details that are slightly off, timelines that don't fully align, facts that shift depending on who they're speaking to. Individually, these inconsistencies are easy to overlook. But over time, a pattern emerges, one where the truth is constantly adjusted, never stable. You may notice that when you revisit the same topic, the story changes in subtle ways. Not enough to trigger immediate alarm, but enough to create uncertainty. They also rely on confidence as a delivery mechanism. The way something is said becomes more convincing than what is being said. There's little hesitation, no visible stress, no searching for words. This lack of friction lowers your defenses. Most people associate deception with nervous behavior, so when that's absent, the information feels more credible. But what you're seeing isn't honesty, it's control over presentation. Another key indicator is unnecessary lying. Situations where there's no clear benefit, no risk involved, and yet the information is still altered. This points to something deeper. The act of controlling information becomes habitual, almost automatic. It's not always about gain, it's about maintaining a consistent advantage, even when it's not required. When confronted, the response follows a familiar structure. First, denial, clear and direct. If that doesn't hold, the narrative shifts. New details are introduced, previous statements are reframed, and the focus moves away from the original claim. If pressure continues, they may question the accuracy of your memory or interpretation. The objective isn't to prove their version, it's to destabilize yours. You'll also notice compartmentalization. Different people receive different versions of the same story, each tailored to fit a specific context. This creates isolated pockets of perception, making it difficult for anyone to compare notes effectively. It's a controlled environment where the truth is fragmented and they remain the only constant across all versions. Over time, this pattern has a cumulative effect. You begin to second-guess what you've heard, what you remember, even what you know to be true. Conversations feel less grounded. Certainty becomes harder to maintain. And in that uncertainty, they gain leverage. Because when truth becomes flexible, control increases. And for someone operating this way, the objective is never just to be believed, it's to define what others accept as reality, one interaction at a time. Most people, when they cross a line, experience some form of internal friction. It may not be immediate, and it may not be visible, but there's usually a shift, something that signals recognition of what happened. With a person who lacks remorse, that internal checkpoint is missing. The behavior occurs, the impact lands, and then nothing. No pause, no recalibration, no visible weight attached to the outcome. What you often see instead is continuity. They move from one moment to the next without carrying anything forward. The conversation changes, the tone resets, and it's as if the previous event never held significance. This creates a disconnect. You're still processing what happened, and they're already operating at baseline. That difference in pacing is one of the first indicators there's no alignment between the impact of the action and their response to it. When acknowledgement does happen, it tends to be structured rather than felt. The words are technically correct phrases that resemble accountability, but the delivery lacks depth. There's no specificity, no clear reference to the behavior, no indication that anything has been internally registered. It functions more like a procedural step than a genuine response. Once it's delivered, they expect the situation to close. If the issue continues to be addressed, the response often shifts. What begins as surface-level acknowledgement can quickly turn into irritation or withdrawal. The focus moves away from what they did and onto the fact that it's still being discussed. The underlying message becomes clear. The problem isn't the action, it's your persistence in bringing it up. This reframes the dynamic, placing pressure on you to disengage rather than on them to reflect. You may also notice a pattern in repetition. The same behaviors reappear in similar contexts, even after being addressed multiple times. There's no visible adjustment, no sign that previous outcomes influenced future decisions. This isn't oversight, it's absence of internal consequence. Without that internal response, there's nothing driving change. Another indicator is how they interpret the effects of their actions. Instead of recognizing impact, they evaluate outcomes based on personal inconvenience. If something creates difficulty for them, loss of access, tension, or external consequences, then it becomes a problem. But if the impact is contained to others, it doesn't register in the same way. The reference point is internal, not relational. Over time, this pattern reshapes the interaction. You begin to anticipate the lack of response, the quick reset, the absence of follow-through. And in that anticipation, expectations adjust. You stop looking for resolution and start managing around the behavior. Because when remorse isn't present, there's no internal mechanism pushing for repair. And without that mechanism, the cycle doesn't break, it simply repeats, consistent and unchanged, regardless of the effect it has on anyone else.